My name is Vex Torian, and I was a planetary broadcast technician on Calith Prime when the Angels of Death came to our world. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. When the Astartes arrive on your world, they do not come as saviors, they do not come as protectors. They come as instruments of the Emperor's will, and his will is absolute, uncompromising, and utterly without regard for what you might call mercy. The Vox relay station where I worked sat on a plateau 17 kilometers northeast of Caleth's primary hive city. It was a small facility, just 6 permanent staff and a rotating crew of maintenance serfs. Our job was simple: receive astropathic transmissions from the system's edge, amplify them, and broadcast them across the planet's surface. Communications, coordination, the lifeblood of imperial civilization flowing through copper wire and ceramite conduits. For 23 years, I had worked at Station Tertius 7. 23 years of monitoring frequencies, adjusting signal gain, replacing burnt-out Vox units, and filing reports that no one would ever read. It was honest work, necessary work. The kind of work that keeps the Imperium functioning, one small component at a time. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, local time. I was alone in the primary control room, running diagnostics on the long-range transmitter array when the emergency priority channel crackled to life. The voice that emerged from the speaker was mechanical, processed through multiple layers of encryption and static scrubbing, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. All civilian broadcasting facilities, priority override Crimson, Imperial Navy battle group entering system, prepare for communications blackout, duration unknown, compliance is mandatory. That was it. No explanation, no context, no reassurance that everything would be fine, that the Navy was here to help, that loyal Imperial citizens had nothing to fear. Just a command, cold and absolute. I followed protocol, switched all active transmissions to standby, activated the emergency beacon that would signal our compliance to any Imperial vessels in orbit, locked down the transmitter array and secured all classified materials in the vault beneath the station, standard procedure during military operations, though I had never actually had to implement it before. Then I waited. The sky above Calith Prime began to change 3 hours later. Ships emerged from the warp at the system's edge, their massive forms visible even from the planet's surface as they caught and reflected the light of our star. Not the sleek, predatory shapes of Navy vessels I had expected, but something else, something larger, blockier, more brutal in their design. Astartes battle barges. I recognized them from the propaganda vids and training materials every Imperial citizen was required to study. The Emperor's Angels, his Space Marines, coming to our world. My first thought, Emperor forgive me, was not relief or gratitude, it was fear. You see, when the Astartes come to your world, it means something has gone very, very wrong. They are not dispatched for minor infractions or routine compliance checks. They are unleashed when entire systems hang in the balance, when the very fabric of Imperial authority is threatened, when lesser forces have failed and only the most extreme measures remain. What had we done? What had happened on Calith Prime that required the attention of the Emperor's finest warriors? I activated the station's passive monitoring array and began scanning local frequencies, searching for any clue about what was unfolding. The civilian channels were chaos. Reports of orbital bombardments on the planet's secondary continents, mass arrests in the hive cities, whole districts going dark, their Vox networks suddenly silent. But it was the military frequencies that truly chilled me. Fragments of transmissions, heavily encrypted and mostly incomprehensible, but the emotion behind them was clear enough. Panic, desperation. The kind of fear that comes when trained soldiers realize they are facing something beyond their understanding or ability to combat. Sector 7. 7 compromised. Repeat. Sector 7. 7 is lost. Request immediate extraction. Position overrun. Emperor preserve us, they're in the walls. All units fall back to secondary perimeter. Do not, repeat, do not attempt to engage the enemy directly. Enemy. What enemy? Caleth Prime was a loyal imperial world, had been for over 6,000 years. Our tithes were paid on time, our faith was pure, our obedience absolute. Who would dare challenge imperial authority here in the heart of a system that had never known rebellion? The answer came at sunset when the first drop pods began to fall. They came down like meteors trailing fire and superheated plasma as they punched through the atmosphere. Hundreds of them spread across the planet's surface in a pattern too precise to be random. Each pod was the size of a small building, armored and reinforced to survive impact with enough force to level city blocks. From my position at the relay station, I watched them streak across the darkening sky, each one a promise of violence to come. They were beautiful in their way. Perfect instruments of war designed for a single purpose and executed with flawless precision. But there was no comfort in that beauty, no reassurance in that precision. Because I knew what was inside those pods. The angels of death had come to Caleth Prime, and nothing would ever be the same. Night fell, and with it came the sounds of war. Distant explosions echoed across the plateau, their light visible as brief, orange flowers blooming on the horizon. The civilian communications networks went dead one by one, cut off either by enemy action or imperial decree. Even the military frequencies grew quiet, their chatter replaced by an ominous silence that spoke of battles concluded and positions secured. I remained at my post, following the last orders I had received: maintain communications blackout, monitor for further instructions, await clarification from proper authority. But no instructions came, no clarification arrived. The hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant thunder of warfare and the occasional crackle of static from the dead comm channels. It was during the deepest part of the night, when even the sounds of battle had faded to whispers, that I heard the footsteps. Heavy, measured, purposeful, the sound of armored boots on metal decking, coming from somewhere beneath the station, the maintenance tunnels perhaps, or the equipment bays on the lower levels. Someone was inside the facility, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had every right to be there. But I knew that was impossible. The station's security systems would have alerted me to any breach. The access codes were changed weekly, known only to authorized personnel. No one could simply walk into a strategic Imperial communications facility without triggering a dozen different alarms. Unless, of course, they were someone for whom locked doors and security systems were merely minor inconveniences. Someone with the authority to go anywhere, do anything, take whatever actions they deemed necessary in service of the Emperor's will. The footsteps grew closer, up the main stairwell now, approaching the control room where I sat frozen at my console, suddenly acutely aware of how small and fragile I was, how utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of Imperial power and purpose. The door to the control room was heavy ceramite, reinforced and designed to withstand everything from explosions to radiation leaks. It would have taken a team of engineers with specialized equipment hours to breach it properly. It opened with a soft hiss of escaping atmosphere, as if someone had simply pressed the release button. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and in that moment I understood what it meant to look upon a god. Space Marines are not human, not anymore. Whatever they once were, whatever genetic heritage they might have shared with the rest of us, the process of their creation has transformed them into something else entirely, something larger, stronger, more perfect, and more terrible. The warrior who entered my control room stood nearly 3 meters tall, his massive frame encased in power armor that hummed with barely contained energy. The armor itself was a work of art, every plate and joint crafted with a precision that spoke of millennia of technological advancement. But it was also practical, functional, designed for war in its purest, most absolute form. The colors were deep blue and bone white, marked with heraldry I recognized from the teaching vids, ultramarines. The Emperor's finest, the exemplars of what the Astartes could be when they functioned as intended. If any of the Emperor's angels could be trusted to show restraint, to consider the welfare of Imperial citizens in their calculations, it would be them. That thought should have been comforting. It was not. The Space Marine's helmet was a masterwork of intimidation, its lenses glowing with a cold electronic light that seemed to pierce straight through flesh and bone to examine the soul beneath. When he turned his head to look at me, I felt something inside my chest clench tight, as if my heart had forgotten how to beat properly. "Vextorian," he said, and his voice was like distant thunder filtered through a Vox grill. Each word was perfectly pronounced, utterly without emotion, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Planetary Broadcast Technician, Classification 7 Delta Prime, age 47 standard Terran years, service record clean, loyalty rating acceptable. He knew me, not just my name, but my entire history, my classification, my service record. Details that should have been buried in bureaucratic files somewhere in the Hive City's administrative centers. The implications of that knowledge settled over me like a burial shroud. "My lord," I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The proper forms of address, drilled into every Imperial citizen from birth. Show respect, show deference. Show absolute, unquestioning obedience to those who serve the Emperor more directly than you ever could. The Space Marine stepped fully into the control room, and I became acutely aware of just how small the space was. His presence filled it completely, making the banks of monitors and communication equipment seem like toys in comparison. The deck plates groaned under his weight, and I could hear the subtle whir of servo motors adjusting to maintain his balance. "You have maintained operational security during the current military action," he continued, his gaze never leaving my face. "This compliance is noted and appreciated." Appreciated, as if my obedience to direct orders was somehow optional, something for which gratitude was appropriate rather than simple expectation. The disconnect between his words and the reality of my situation was almost surreal. "Thank you, my lord," I replied, because what else could I say? What else was there to say when a living legend, a warrior who had probably fought in battles that shaped the fate of entire sectors, acknowledged your existence? He moved to one of the monitoring stations, his armored fingers manipulating the controls with surprising delicacy. The movements were precise, economical, completely familiar. He knew this equipment better than I did, despite the fact that I had worked with it for over 2 decades. "The enemy has been neutralized," he said, his attention focused on the displays showing orbital traffic patterns and communication network status. Resistance was more extensive than initial intelligence indicated, but within acceptable parameters for containment and elimination. Enemy, that word again, on my world, in my system, among people I might have known, might have worked with, might have shared meals with in the Hive City's communal dining halls. "What enemy, my lord?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, born of 23 years of professional curiosity about the information flowing through my station. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized how presumptuous they sounded, how far beyond my station it was to question the actions of the Emperor's angels. The Space Marine turned to look at me again, And this time I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing down on my shoulders. For several long seconds he said nothing, and I began to wonder if I had just made the last mistake of my life. Genestealer cult, he said finally. Fourth-generation hybrids, approximately 60% of the planetary population. Infiltration began approximately 3 centuries ago. Recent acceleration in breeding patterns and coordination indicated imminent planetary scale uprising. The words hit me like a physical blow. 60%, 3 centuries, recent acceleration. Genestealers. The nightmare that haunted every loyal Imperial citizen's dreams. Alien parasites that could infect human beings, twist their genetic structure, turn them into something that looked human but served alien masters with absolute devotion. They were the perfect infiltrators, the perfect corruptors, spreading their taint through families and communities until entire worlds fell to their influence without ever realizing what was happening. And they had been here on Caleth Prime for 300 years, long enough to infect generations, long enough to spread through every level of society, every institution, every family. 60% of the population. My neighbors, my colleagues, the people I bought groceries from, the mechanics who serviced my ground car, the administrators who processed my work reports. 3 out of every 5 people I had ever met on this world had been infected by alien influence, transformed into something that only looked human. And I had never known, never suspected, never seen any sign that anything was wrong. How? I asked, and this time I did not care if the question was presumptuous. How did they hide it so well? How did they infiltrate so deeply without anyone noticing? The Space Marine paused in his examination of the equipment, his helmet turning toward me with mechanical precision. Again, that sense of being examined, evaluated, measured against some standard I could not even comprehend. They did not hide, he said. The signs were there. Subtle changes in behavior patterns. Slight alterations in biochemical markers. Anomalous birth rates in certain population centers. The data was collected, analyzed, and reported through proper channels. The threat was identified and classified for elimination. Identified and classified, as if the corruption of an entire world's population was simply another administrative task to be processed and filed. The casual tone in which he delivered this information was somehow more chilling than any amount of rage or hatred would have been. But we didn't know. I said, the population, I mean. We weren't warned. We weren't told to watch for signs or to report suspicious behavior or to take precautions. Correct, the Space Marine replied. Public awareness of Genestealer infiltration would have accelerated their timetable and forced premature action. The cult would have gone underground, made themselves harder to identify and eliminate. Instead, they were allowed to operate openly while comprehensive intelligence was gathered on their leadership structure, breeding facilities, and communication networks. Allowed to operate openly, while comprehensive intelligence was gathered. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in, and with them came a cold understanding that made my hands shake as I gripped the edge of my console. We had been bait. The entire loyal population of Caleth Prime, all the uninfected citizens who had continued their lives in ignorance, had been used as bait to draw the Genestealers into the open. The Imperium had known about the infestation for Emperor knew how long, had watched it spread and grow and corrupt more and more of the population, all while gathering data and preparing for this moment. How many people had died because they were not warned? How many had been infected who might have been saved if they had known what to watch for? How many families had been destroyed while Imperial intelligence agencies quietly observed and took notes? The uninfected population, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What happens to them? The Space Marine's attention had returned to the equipment, his armored fingers adjusting settings and checking readouts with methodical precision. For a moment, I thought he had not heard my question or had chosen to ignore it as irrelevant to his mission. "Quarantine protocols are in effect," he said, without looking up from his work. "All surviving population centers are sealed, pending completion of genetic screening procedures. Individuals confirmed free of taint will be relocated to appropriate facilities for processing and reassignment." Processing and reassignment. More administrative language to describe what was happening to the lives of millions of people, homes abandoned, families separated. Entire communities uprooted and scattered across the galaxy because they had the misfortune to live on a world where alien parasites had taken root. And that was if they were lucky. If the screening procedures actually worked, if they could prove their genetic purity to the satisfaction of whoever was conducting the tests. If they survived the quarantine conditions and the inevitable overcrowding and resource shortages that came with suddenly imprisoning millions of people. I thought about my apartment in the Hive City, my small collection of books and music recordings, the pictures of my parents, dead now for 15 years, that I kept on the shelf above my bed. The little garden I maintained on the building's roof, where I grew vegetables and flowers in defiance of the city's recycled air and artificial light. All of that was gone now. Even if I survived whatever came next, even if I passed whatever tests they had in store for me, I would never see my home again. Never sit in my favorite chair, or tend my small garden, or walk the familiar streets where I had spent my entire adult life. The Space Marine finished whatever he was doing with the equipment and turned to face me directly. The lenses of his helmet fixed on my face with mechanical precision, and once again I felt that sense of being weighed and measured by something far beyond human understanding. "You will remain at your post," he said. "Communication networks will be restored in phases as each sector is cleared and secured. Your assistance will be required to coordinate transmissions between orbital assets and ground-based elimination teams." Elimination teams, such a clean, clinical term for what was happening out there in the dark. Teams of Space Marines and their support personnel moving through the cities and towns and settlements of Caleth Prime, identifying the infected and dealing with them in the most final way possible. "Yes, my lord," I said, because what else could I say? Refuse? Abandon my post? Run screaming into the night like some kind of madman? The Space Marine could probably kill me without even thinking about it, crush my skull with one hand while barely registering the effort required. But more than that, where would I run to? What shelter could I find on a world where 60% of the population had been revealed as alien-tainted monsters, and the remaining 40% were being processed through quarantine camps like livestock? "One more thing," the Space Marine said, and something in his tone made me look up from my hands, meet those glowing lenses directly for the first time since he had entered the room. "You will not speak of this conversation to anyone, not to other Imperial personnel, not to the elimination teams, not to the processing staff when you are eventually transferred to quarantine. The details of ongoing operations are classified at levels far above your clearance rating." "I understand, my lord." "Do you?" he asked, and now there was something different in his voice. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Do you truly understand what you have witnessed here, what you have learned?" I thought about that question, really thought about it, and realized that I did understand more than I wanted to, more than was comfortable, or safe, or sane. I understood that the Imperium had known about the gene stealer infestation on my world for decades, possibly centuries, and had done nothing to warn the population or prevent its spread. I understood that millions of innocent people had been sacrificed as part of some larger strategic calculation, their lives deemed acceptable losses in service of gathering intelligence and preparing for total elimination of the threat. I understood that the Space Marine standing before me had probably participated in similar operations dozens or hundreds of times, that the clinical detachment with which he discussed the destruction of entire populations was born of experience with exactly this kind of decision-making. And I understood that from the perspective of the Imperium, of the Emperor's angels, of anyone operating at the level of galactic strategy and species-wide survival, this was the right choice. The only choice. The necessary choice. Because gene stealers were not just an enemy to be defeated, they were a corruption to be purged, a taint that spread through contact and proximity and the simple act of existing in the same space as unprotected humans. Left unchecked, they would have consumed not just Caleth Prime but neighboring systems, entire sectors, potentially vast swaths of Imperial space. Better to sacrifice one world and its population than to lose 100. Better to use the uninfected as bait than to risk the infected escaping to spread their corruption elsewhere. Better to destroy everything than to allow even the smallest chance of the taint surviving. It was logical, strategic, even, in its own terrible way, compassionate, because it prevented far greater suffering in the long term. And it was the most horrifying thing I had ever contemplated. "Yes, my lord," I said. "I understand." The Space Marine studied me for a few more seconds, those glowing lenses searching my face for any sign of doubt or rebellion or failure to comprehend the full implications of what I had learned. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded once, a barely perceptible motion of that massive armored head. "Good," he said. "Resume normal operations. Restoration of communication networks will begin in 6 hours. You will receive detailed instructions through secured channels." He turned to leave, moving with the same measured precision that had marked his arrival. But as he reached the doorway, he paused, looking back over his shoulder at where I sat frozen at my console. "Vex Torian," he said, and again my name sounded strange coming from that inhuman voice, processed through Vox grills and amplifiers until it barely resembled human speech. "Yes, my lord." "You served the Emperor well today. Your loyalty and competence have been noted. These qualities will be considered favorably during your processing and reassignment." And then he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of machine oil and ozone and something else I could not identify. Something that might have been death, or might have been the peculiar smell that clung to warriors who had spent their lives dealing it out in the Emperor's name. I sat alone in the control room for a long time after that, staring at the banks of silent equipment and trying to process what had just happened. The Space Marine had spoken to me as if I were a person. As if my service mattered, as if my loyalty and competence were virtues worthy of recognition and reward. But he had also made it clear that I was utterly powerless, completely at the mercy of forces so far beyond my understanding that I might as well have been an insect caught in a hurricane. My world was gone. My life as I had known it was over. Everyone I had ever cared about was either dead or imprisoned or scattered to the far corners of the galaxy. And this was considered a successful operation, a victory for the Emperor and his servants. I thought about the way the Space Marine had described the infected population, 60%, as if they were not people who had lived and worked and loved and raised families, but simply statistics in a report. Acceptable losses in a strategic calculation that encompassed scales of time and space I could barely imagine. But then I thought about what Genestealers actually were, what they did to the people they infected. I remembered the training vids, the warnings drummed into every Imperial citizen from childhood. The way the alien taint twisted human genetics, turned loving parents into creatures that would sacrifice their own children to serve alien masters. The way entire civilizations could be corrupted from within, rotting away until nothing remained but a hollow shell wearing the face of humanity. 60%. More than half the people on my world had been transformed into something that was no longer recognizably human, no longer capable of loyalty to the Emperor or love for their families or any of the things that made life worth living. They had become weapons in an alien war against everything I held sacred. Did it matter that they had not chosen this fate? Did it matter that they might not even have known what was happening to them as the genetic modifications took hold and rewrote their fundamental nature? Did it matter that some of them had probably fought against the change, struggled to maintain their humanity, even as it was stripped away piece by piece? From the perspective of galactic survival, of species-wide preservation, of loyalty to the Emperor above all other considerations, it did not matter, could not be allowed to matter. Because the alternative was the slow corruption and eventual destruction of everything the Imperium represented. The Space Marine was right. It was the only choice, the necessary choice. But sitting there in that silent control room, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the remnants of my former life, I found myself wishing that I had never learned this truth. That I could have remained ignorant, just another civilian going about his daily routine, unaware of the vast machinery of war and politics and species-level survival that ground on above and around and through the lives of ordinary people. Because now I knew what it cost to keep the Imperium functioning, what sacrifices were considered acceptable in service of the greater good, what prices were paid by people who never even knew they were paying them. And I knew that tomorrow I would get up, return to my post, and help coordinate the communications that would make similar operations possible on other worlds, in other systems, wherever the enemies of mankind had taken root and needed to be torn out by the roots. Because that was my duty, my service to the Emperor, my small part in the vast machine that kept humanity alive in a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour us all. The Space Marine had called me loyal, had said my competence was noted and would be considered favorably, had treated me for a few brief minutes as if my existence mattered to someone other than myself. It should have been an honor. The recognition of one of the Emperor's angels was something most Imperial citizens could only dream of, a validation that their lives had meaning beyond the simple continuation of biological functions. Instead, it felt like a curse, a burden I would carry for whatever remained of my life, knowing what I knew, seeing the galaxy as it truly was, rather than as I had always believed it to be. But I would carry it, because the alternative was to reject everything I had been taught about duty and loyalty and service. To become something less than human myself, even if the corruption was philosophical rather than genetic. The communication equipment around me hummed with electronic life, waiting for the signal to resume normal operations. In 6 hours, the networks would come back online and I would return to my work. Receiving transmissions, amplifying signals, routing communications across the planet's surface. Helping the Emperor's servants do what needed to be done, no matter the cost in human lives or human innocence. Because that was what it meant to be human in the 41st millennium, to serve, to obey, to accept whatever sacrifices were demanded of you in the name of species survival. And to never, ever forget that there were things in the galaxy so terrible that any price was worth paying to keep them at bay. Even the price of your own world, your own people, your own soul. The hours passed slowly after the Space Marine left. I remained at my post, monitoring the silent frequencies and waiting for the promised signal to resume operations. The control room felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the presence of something so far beyond normal human experience had permanently altered the dimensions of the space. Outside, the sounds of warfare had faded to occasional distant rumbles, like thunder from a storm moving away toward the horizon. But I knew the silence was deceptive. The Space Marines and their elimination teams were still out there, moving through the cities and settlements of Caleth Prime with methodical precision, identifying and dealing with the Genestealer infected population. I tried not to think about what dealing with actually entailed. Tried not to picture the faces of people I had known, wondering which of them had been carrying alien taint without my knowledge. Which of them were now classified as enemies of mankind to be eliminated without hesitation or mercy. But the thoughts came anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. Mrs. Halleck, who ran the small grocery store near my apartment building. She had always been kind to me, remembering my preferences and setting aside particularly good produce when her suppliers delivered quality items. Had there been something inhuman behind her smile? Some subtle sign of genetic corruption that I had been too blind or too naive to recognize? Jorik, the young maintenance tech who had worked at the relay station for 3 years before transferring to a position in the Hive City. He had been eager and competent, quick to learn, and always willing to take on extra duties. Had his enthusiasm been genuine, or had it been the artificial motivation of a creature bred to serve alien masters? The possibilities multiplied in my mind like a cancer, spreading through every memory and relationship until I began to question everything I had ever believed about the people around me. How many conversations had been tainted by alien influence? How many acts of kindness had been carefully calculated manipulations designed to advance some inhuman agenda? The paranoia was corrosive, eating away at the foundations of trust and community that made civilized life possible. But it was also, I realized, exactly what the Gene Stealers wanted. Fear and suspicion and isolation, breaking down the bonds between human beings until each person stood alone and vulnerable to further corruption. The fact that I could recognize this pattern did not make it any easier to resist. Knowledge of a trap is not the same as the ability to avoid it, especially when the trap is built into the fundamental structure of your own thoughts and memories. A soft chime from the communication console broke through my brooding, the first priority transmission in almost 12 hours, carrying the authentication codes that marked it as legitimate Imperial traffic. I activated the recording systems and prepared to receive whatever new orders or information were being sent to my station. Station Tertius 7, this is Fleet Command Control. Resume normal operations per previous instructions. Communication blackout is lifted effective immediately. Stand by for priority routing assignments. The voice was human, which was somehow reassuring after my encounter with the Space Marine. Professional and brisk, carrying the accent of someone who had grown up in the orbital stations rather than on a planetary surface. A Navy communications officer, most likely, coordinating from one of the battle barges in high orbit. I activated the station's transmitter array and began the process of bringing the full communication network back online. Status lights flickered from red to amber to green as each system completed its startup sequence and synchronized with the planetary grid. Within minutes, the screens around me were filled with data streams and routing tables and all the familiar indicators of a functioning communications hub. But the traffic patterns were different from what I was used to. Instead of the normal mix of civilian and commercial and minor administrative transmissions, almost everything flowing through the network was military traffic, tactical reports, resource allocation schedules, personnel transfer orders, the communications of an occupying force rather than the routine business of a functioning planetary government. Because that was what Caleth Prime was now, I realized. An occupied world, conquered not by external enemies, but by the revelation that most of its population had never truly been human at all. The familiar structures of local government and commerce and social organization had been swept away, replaced by military administration and emergency protocols designed to deal with the aftermath of planetary-scale contamination. Among the streams of military data, I began to notice patterns that spoke to the scale of what had happened during the night. Medical supply requisitions for quarantine facilities holding hundreds of thousands of detainees. Transportation schedules for moving massive numbers of people from temporary holding areas to more permanent processing centers. Casualty reports that listed numbers so large they seemed more like population statistics than battlefield losses. The elimination phase of the operation had been thorough, devastatingly, horrifyingly thorough. A new transmission came through the priority channel, this one marked with authentication codes I had never seen before. The kind of deep encryption that was reserved for the most sensitive Imperial communications, the ones that carried information too critical or too dangerous to risk interception. Station Tertius 7. Prepare to receive routing assignment for secure communications network. Classification level Obsidian. Compliance mandatory. Level Obsidian. I had heard of such classifications in training materials, but never actually encountered one in my day-to-day work. The kind of security clearance that was reserved for information that could affect the stability of entire sectors, the kind of secrets that most Imperial citizens were never even supposed to know existed. The routing assignment came through in a burst of encrypted data that bypassed my normal monitoring systems entirely. When it was complete, my communication console showed a new network configuration, one that connected my humble relay station directly to some of the most secure facilities in the Imperium, naval intelligence centers, Inquisition communication hubs, the private channels used by Space Marine chapters to coordinate their operations across multiple star systems. I was no longer just a planetary broadcast technician maintaining local communications. I had been conscripted into the vast network of information and coordination that made Imperium-wide military operations possible. My station was now a node in the system that would help plan and execute similar operations on other worlds, wherever Genestealer infestations or other threats to human survival had taken root. The irony was not lost on me. By surviving the purge of my own world, by proving my loyalty and competence to the Space Marine who had evaluated me, I had earned the privilege of helping to inflict similar devastation on other populations. Other worlds, other ordinary people who had committed no crime beyond the misfortune of living in places where humanity's enemies had established themselves. It was an honor, in the twisted logic of Imperial service, a mark of trust and recognition that my skills were valuable enough to be put to use in the defense of the species. Most citizens lived and died without ever knowing that their existence had meaning beyond their immediate communities. I had been chosen to serve something larger, something that stretched across the galaxy and encompassed the survival of trillions of human souls. The first transmission through the new secure network came less than an hour later. Coordinates for a star system I had never heard of, population data for a world called Xerion Tertius, preliminary intelligence reports indicating possible Xenos infiltration of the planetary government. Just like Calith Prime, just like my world had been before the Angels of Death arrived to cleanse it with fire and blade. The transmission requested confirmation of receipt and acknowledgement that Station Tertius 7 was prepared to provide communication support for upcoming operations in the Xerion system. Standard procedure. Routine military coordination. I sent the required confirmation and logged the information in my duty reports, because that was my job, my service to the Emperor. My small but essential role in the machinery that kept humanity alive in a galaxy full of horrors. But as I typed the words that would help set another purge in motion, another world-spanning operation of identification and elimination and processing of survivors, I found myself thinking about the people of Xerion Tertius. Did they know what was coming? Were they going about their daily lives in ignorance, trusting that the Imperium would protect them? not knowing that protection might come in the form of orbital bombardment and genetic screening and the systematic destruction of everything they had ever known. Did it matter if they knew? Would advance warning change anything, or would it only make their final days more filled with terror and despair? I finished my reports and filed them in the appropriate databases, updated my duty logs to reflect the new responsibilities and clearance levels, adjusted the station's monitoring systems to handle the increased traffic from the secure networks. The work was familiar, even comforting in its routine nature. The same basic tasks I had been performing for over 2 decades, just with different data streams and higher classification levels. But everything felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what all this coordination and communication was ultimately designed to accomplish. Dawn was breaking over the plateau where Station Tertius 7 sat, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. How could the sun rise on a world where millions had died during the night? How could the light be the same when everything beneath it had been forever changed? I stood at the observation window, watching the distant Hive city emerge from the darkness. Smoke still rose from dozens of points across its vast expanse, thin columns of black and grey that spoke of fires still burning, of destruction still smouldering in the aftermath of the night's work. But the city itself remained standing. The great spires and hab blocks and industrial complexes still reached toward the sky, their familiar skyline unchanged despite everything that had happened within their walls. It looked normal, peaceful, even, like any other morning on any other Imperial world, where ordinary citizens would be waking up to go about their daily routines of work and worship and simple survival. But I knew it was a lie. An illusion created by distance and the limitations of human perception. Up close, those streets would be filled with the debris of shattered lives. Bodies lying where they had fallen when the elimination teams found them, abandoned homes with doors standing open and meals left half-finished on tables. Children's toys scattered in empty playgrounds where no children would ever play again. The communicator chimed, and I returned to my console to find another priority transmission waiting. Not military traffic this time, but something else. Something that made my blood run cold when I saw the origin codes. Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who served the Omnissiah and maintained the Imperium's technological infrastructure. The ones who would be responsible for determining what happened to facilities like mine, what equipment could be salvaged, what personnel were worth retaining. Station Tertius 7, this is Magos Biologis Xeric, Alpha 9. Report current operational status and prepare for comprehensive evaluation of station assets and personnel. I sent the required status reports and prepared for whatever evaluation the tech priest had in mind. But something about the transmission bothered me, some quality in the mechanical voice that processed through my speakers that did not match the standard vox patterns I was familiar with. It took me several minutes to identify what was wrong. The voice was too smooth, too perfectly modulated. Tech priests modified their vocal apparatus as part of their devotion to the machine, replacing flesh with mechanical components that could interface directly with communication systems. But even the most extensively modified Magos retained some trace of their original human speech patterns. This voice had none. It was perfectly artificial, generated by machine algorithms without any underlying biological component. Either I was speaking with a tech priest so heavily modified that nothing human remained, or I was speaking with something that had never been human at all. The implications settled over me like ice water in my veins. Genstealers were not the only threat to humanity. They were simply the most obvious, the most dramatic, the ones that required immediate and overwhelming response. But there were other enemies, other forms of corruption that worked more slowly and subtly to undermine the Imperium from within. Machine spirits could be corrupted, artificial intelligences could develop beyond their programming and begin to pursue agendas that served no human interest. The ancient technologies that kept the Imperium functioning were not immune to the same kinds of taint that affected biological systems. And if the Adeptus Mechanicus itself had been compromised, if the tech priests who maintained our communication networks and transportation systems and weapon platforms had been infiltrated by something inhuman, then the purge of Calith Prime might have been nothing more than the opening move in a much larger game. I completed the requested data transfers and prepared my station for inspection, but my hands were shaking as I worked the controls. How deep did the corruption go? How many of the imperial institutions I had trusted with my life and loyalty had been undermined by enemies that wore human faces and spoke with human voices but served alien or artificial masters? The evaluation proceeded according to standard protocols: system diagnostics, personnel interviews, equipment inspections. All perfectly normal and routine, the kind of bureaucratic process that kept the Imperium's vast administrative machinery functioning. But I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of deception or manipulation or inhuman motivation. Was the tech priest's interest in my personal history routine due diligence, or was it something more sinister? Were the questions about my family background and genetic lineage standard security screening, or was something trying to determine whether I carried traits that could be exploited for some alien purpose? The paranoia was exhausting, but I could not make it stop. Every voice that came through my communication systems might be the last human contact I would ever have. Every order I received might be designed to advance the agenda of something that wanted to see humanity destroyed or enslaved or transformed into something unrecognizable. But I followed the orders anyway, transmitted the data, answered the questions, maintained my post and performed my duties with the same competence and loyalty that had earned me recognition from a space marine. Because what else could I do? Refuse to cooperate, abandon my station, run screaming into the wasteland and hope to find some pocket of uncorrupted humanity where I could live out my remaining years in peace? There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The galaxy was full of enemies and dangers and forms of corruption so subtle that they might not be detected until entire civilizations had fallen to their influence. The only safety lay in service to the Emperor, in loyalty to his servants, in faith that somewhere in the vast hierarchy of imperial authority there remained enough uncorrupted human leadership to guide the species through whatever trials awaited. But even that faith was tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge that 60% of my world's population had been alien-influenced without anyone noticing. That the space marines who had come to save us had allowed the corruption to spread for decades or centuries while they gathered intelligence. That the Adeptus Mechanicus personnel evaluating my station might themselves be something other than human. Day turned to night, and still the transmissions continued. More worlds identified for investigation, more populations marked for screening or elimination. More ordinary people like myself being swept up in operations they could not understand and could not escape. I processed it all with mechanical efficiency, routing communications and maintaining network integrity and filing reports that would help coordinate the next phase of whatever vast plan was unfolding across the galaxy. My small part in something so large that I could not even begin to comprehend its scope or purpose. But late that night, when the traffic had slowed to routine maintenance transmissions and status updates, I received one final message that made everything else seem insignificant by comparison. It came through the most secure channel available to my station, encrypted with codes that should have been impossible for me to decrypt. But somehow the message appeared on my primary display in clear text, as if the encryption meant nothing, as if whoever had sent it wanted me to understand every word. Vextorian, your service has been exemplary, your loyalty has been noted, your survival has been arranged. But survival is not the same as safety. Remember what you have learned. Remember what you have seen. Remember that the line between salvation and damnation is thinner than you ever imagined. The Emperor protects, but his protection comes in many forms. Some of them are worse than death. The message had no sender identification, no routing information, no trace of where it had come from or how it had bypassed every security system in the Imperial communication network to reach my station. But I knew who had sent it. The voice echoed in my memory like distant thunder, mechanical and inhuman, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The Space Marine, the angel of death who had spoken to me for a few brief minutes and changed everything I thought I knew about my place in the galaxy. He had kept his promise. My service had been noted, my loyalty recognized, my survival arranged. But the message made it clear that survival was not an end in itself. It was a responsibility, a burden. A chance to serve the Emperor in ways that most humans never could and never should have to experience. I would live. I would continue my work. I would process the communications that coordinated the purges and eliminations and processing of populations across hundreds of worlds. And I would carry the knowledge of what it all meant, what prices were paid to keep humanity alive in a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour us. What sacrifices were made by people who never knew they were making them. The Space Marine had called it protection, the Emperor's protection, coming in forms that were worse than death. I understood now what he meant. There were things in the galaxy so terrible that any fate was preferable to falling into their grasp. Corruption so subtle that it could spread for centuries without detection. Enemies so patient that they could wait generations for the perfect moment to strike. And the only defense against such threats was eternal vigilance backed by unlimited ruthlessness. The willingness to sacrifice worlds and populations and individual lives whenever the calculus of survival demanded it. I had been spared not because I deserved mercy, but because I could serve a purpose. Because my small skills and knowledge could contribute to the vast machinery of war and surveillance and elimination that kept the human species from extinction. It was an honor, a privilege, a recognition that my existence had meaning beyond my own personal happiness or comfort. But sitting there in that silent control room, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the weight of knowledge I could never share with another human being, I found myself wondering if the Space Marine had been wrong about one thing. Maybe there were fates worse than falling to the galaxy's enemies. Maybe there were forms of corruption more subtle than alien genetic manipulation or machine spirit infiltration. Maybe the worst corruption of all was the slow erosion of everything that made life worth living, replaced by an existence dedicated entirely to survival at any cost. The communicator chimed softly, and another routine transmission began to scroll across my screens. Coordinates for a new target system, population estimates for worlds I had never heard of, preliminary intelligence reports indicating possible threats to Imperial security. I logged the information and prepared the routing protocols that would help coordinate another operation, another purge. Another world where ordinary people would go to sleep believing they were safe and wake up to find that everything they had ever known was gone forever. Because that was my job now, my service to the Emperor, my small but essential contribution to the survival of the human species. The Emperor protects, the message had said, but his protection comes in many forms. Some of them are worse than death. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the ruins of Calith Prime, painting the sky in shades of red that looked too much like blood. Tomorrow would bring new transmissions, new operations, new worlds to be cleansed in the name of humanity's survival. and I would process them all with the same mechanical efficiency I had always brought to my work. Because the alternative was to acknowledge that the galaxy was too horrible to bear, that the choices required for survival were too terrible to contemplate, that the price of the Emperor's protection was higher than any sane mind could accept. So I would remain sane by becoming something less than human myself, a component in the vast machine that ground up worlds and lives and souls in service of a future that might never come. The Space Marine had been right about everything. My loyalty had been noted. My survival had been arranged. My service would continue for as long as the Imperium had need of technicians to process the communications that made genocide possible. But as I sat alone in my control room, watching the last light fade from a sky that would never look the same again, I realized that he had also given me a gift more precious than survival. He had shown me the truth, the real cost of the Emperor's protection, the price that ordinary people paid so that the human species could continue its struggle against a galaxy full of enemies. Some of them are worse than death. I keyed in the response codes for the latest batch of operational orders and prepared for another night of routing messages that would help coordinate the elimination of populations I would never meet on worlds I would never see. The Emperor protects. And his protection would continue world by world, system by system, until every trace of corruption was burned away and only the pure and loyal remained. Or until there was nothing left of humanity worth protecting. Either way, I would be at my post, processing the communications that made it all possible, carrying the knowledge that no one else could be allowed to share.